There's a photograph on my fireplace mantel that I've looked at every single day for the past 11 years. In it, my wife Carol is laughing at something off camera. Her hair's still dark, except for the few silver strands she always pretended not to notice. My son Daniel is maybe 19 in that picture, leaning into her shoulder, grinning the way he used to grin before he learned to perform smiles instead of feel them. I don't know who took it. I found it in a shoebox after the funeral and had it framed the same week. Some mornings I walk past it without stopping. Some mornings I stand there for a long time. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what I was before everything happened. I was a man who built his whole life around two people. When one of them was taken from me by a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I redirected everything I had left toward the other one. That's not wisdom. That's just what grief does to a father. It narrows your world until the one remaining light looks 10 times brighter than it actually is. My name is Richard. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, worked my way up to running my own small contracting company. Nothing glamorous, but honest. I own a house in Dayton, Ohio that Carol and I bought when Daniel was 4. The mortgage has been paid off for 6 years. I have a retirement account, a decent truck, a workshop in the garage where I still fix things that don't need fixing just to keep my hands busy. That's my life. That's what I had to offer. Daniel grew up in that house. He was a good kid, not perfect, but genuinely good in the ways that matter. He helped neighbors carry groceries. He called his mother every Sunday, even after he went to college. When Carol died, he drove home that same night. Didn't wait for morning. Just got in his car and drove 4 hours because he said he couldn't be away from me. We sat at the kitchen table until almost dawn, drinking bad coffee and not saying much. And that was one of the most important nights of my life. He met Vanessa 2 years after his mother died. He was 26. She was 24 and working in marketing at a firm downtown. She was beautiful in the kind of way that makes you a little nervous, the kind of beauty that comes with an awareness of itself. The first time Daniel brought her home, she spent 20 minutes complimenting my kitchen before I realized she hadn't actually said anything specific about it. Just variations of love this, and so charming that could have applied to any kitchen in any house, anywhere. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Grief makes you suspicious of happiness, I thought. Don't be that father. I tried hard not to be that father. I took them both out to dinner 3 times in the first year. I offered Daniel money for a down payment on an apartment when they moved in together. I sent Vanessa a birthday card and a gift card to a restaurant she'd mentioned once in passing, just so she'd know I'd been listening. When Daniel called to tell me he was going to propose, I cried a little, which embarrassed us both, and then I told him his mother would have been thrilled, which was true. He asked me if I had her engagement ring, the simple one with the small round diamond that I'd saved up 4 months to buy in 1987. I told him yes, I had it, and that he could have it whenever he was ready. He never asked for it again. I found out later that Vanessa had told him the ring was sweet, but not really her style. I found that out much later, the way I found out most things about Vanessa after the fact, from second-hand sources, in the wreckage. The engagement was announced in the fall. Daniel called me first, which I appreciated, and then I heard nothing for about 6 weeks. I assumed they were busy. They were busy building a wedding that had apparently been in Vanessa's imagination since she was old enough to flip through bridal magazines. A wedding that involved a venue in Columbus that rented for $14,000 for a single Saturday, a caterer who charged $40 a plate, a photographer whose base package started at $8,000, a florist who'd done 3 celebrity events in Chicago, and a honeymoon at a resort in the Maldives that cost more per night than I used to make in a week. When Daniel finally called me about the wedding, I was in my workshop fixing a lamp that didn't need fixing. He sounded strange on the phone, careful, like he was reading from something. He told me the total estimated cost was $226,000. I put down the lamp. He explained, in this same careful voice, that Vanessa's parents had recently gone through a difficult financial period. Her father had made some bad investments. They weren't in a position to contribute significantly to the wedding. He explained that Vanessa had always envisioned a certain kind of celebration, that it was important to her, that she had been dreaming about this her whole life. He explained that he and Vanessa had talked it over extensively and agreed that, given the circumstances, it would make sense for me to cover the costs. He said they would pay me back over time. He said it would be an investment in their future. He said he knew it was a lot to ask. I sat in my workshop for a moment after he finished. I asked him, as calmly as I could, whether he understood what he was asking me. I told him that $226,000 was not far from my entire retirement savings. I told him I was 62 years old and not planning on going back to running electrical crews full-time. I told him I loved him and I wanted his wedding to be wonderful, but that I needed him to help me understand how this number made sense. He got quiet. Then he said that he thought I'd want to do this for him, that Mom would have wanted me to do this for him. That was the first time he used his mother to move me. It wouldn't be the last. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, okay. When I called back 3 days later to say I could contribute $50,000, which was genuinely significant and which I'd calculated carefully against what I'd need to live on, he went quiet again. Then he said he'd talk to Vanessa. He called back the next evening. He said $50,000 wasn't going to be workable. He said the deposit on the venue alone was $17,000 and non-refundable once it was placed. He said Vanessa was really upset. He said he didn't know what to do. His voice had a quality in it I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, that particular helplessness that boys perform when they want their fathers to fix things. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because it's not my proudest moment. I said yes, not to the full amount, but to $80,000, because I looked at that photograph on the mantel, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about the fact that Daniel was all I had left of that life, and I thought that maybe I was being too cautious, too careful, too much the practical electrician when I should have been the generous father. I transferred $80,000 into Daniel's account over the following month. That was in January. By March, something had shifted. The calls got shorter. Daniel stopped calling on Sunday mornings, which had been our habit since Carol died. When I asked about wedding details, wanting to be involved, Vanessa would apparently be in the background, because suddenly Daniel would start speaking in shorter sentences, like he was summarizing a longer conversation he was having with someone else. I asked about the rehearsal dinner. He said they were keeping it small. I asked about my role in the ceremony. He said they hadn't finalized everything yet. I asked if I could meet with them both for dinner, my treat, just to talk through the plans. He said they'd let me know when their schedule opened up. Their schedule never opened up. In April, I drove to Columbus unannounced, which I recognize was not ideal, but I'd left 3 voicemails and 2 texts, and heard back a total of once. A 3-word reply that said, "Crazy busy here." I knocked on their apartment door on a Saturday afternoon. Vanessa answered. She was polished as always, put together, not a hair wrong, and the look on her face when she saw me lasted only half a second before the smile replaced it. But I'm 63 and I've been reading faces my whole life. The look was not happy to see me. She told me Daniel was out. She told me he'd be back later. She did not invite me inside. I stood on their doorstep for a moment. This woman my son was going to marry, looking at me like I was a delivery driver who'd come to the wrong address, and I said something I probably shouldn't have said but meant completely honestly. I said, "Vanessa, I'm not sure what I've done to make things difficult between us, but I'd like to fix it if I can. I love my son, and I want us all to get along." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, in the most pleasant voice imaginable, that she wasn't sure what I meant, that everything was totally fine, and that she'd let Daniel know I stopped by. The door closed. I drove 4 hours home and sat in my kitchen for a while. I called Daniel that evening. He picked up, which surprised me. He sounded strained. He said he'd heard I'd stopped by. I said yes. He said it might be better if I gave them some space during the wedding planning, that Vanessa was stressed, and unexpected visits made things harder. I asked him, very directly, whether something was wrong between us, whether I'd done something to offend Vanessa, whether there was a conversation we needed to have. He said no. He said everything was fine. He said he appreciated everything I'd done. I asked if I was going to be involved in the wedding ceremony. Would I walk him down the aisle? Would I give a toast? Was there a role for his father at his wedding? He was quiet for a moment, A long moment, and then he said that they were keeping the ceremony very small and intimate, that it was mostly Vanessa's family and close friends, that they'd already had some difficult conversations about the guest list. I asked him directly, "Daniel, am I invited to your wedding?" He said, "Dad, I think it's going to be better for everyone if you're not there." I did not say anything for probably 15 seconds. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd sat together the night his mother died, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing I'd heard in 11 years. I said, "Okay, I hear you." I hung up the phone. I did not cry, which surprised me. I sat very still for a long time, and then I went to my workshop, and I fixed the lamp that I'd already fixed twice before, and I stayed out there until past midnight. Here is something I want you to understand, because this matters. I did not immediately decide to do anything. I didn't plot or scheme or strategize. I was a 62-year-old man who had been told by his only son, 4 months after giving that son $80,000, that he was not welcome at the wedding. I was mostly just tired. I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. My neighbor Howard, who has been my friend for 22 years and who knew Carol almost as well as I did, came over the following Saturday with a six-pack and the pretense of watching a game. I told him what had happened. Howard is a retired judge, which means he listens to everything you say before he responds, a quality that is genuinely rare and valuable. He listened to the whole story. Then he asked me 2 questions. He asked, "Have you gotten anything in writing about the 80,000?" I said no. He asked, "What happens to your retirement if you don't get it back?" I did the math out loud. Howard raised his eyebrows slightly, the way retired judges do when they're being diplomatic about bad news. I started making calls on Monday. I called my accountant first, then a financial advisor I'd used twice before. Then an attorney Howard recommended who specialized in family matters and was, Howard assured me, the kind of person who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Her name was Patricia, and she had an office downtown, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she made me feel, within about 10 minutes, that my situation was not as unusual as I'd imagined. Patricia asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Had I documented the transfer? Yes, obviously. Bank records. Did I have any written agreement, any text or email, about the nature of the money loan versus gift? I thought about it and realized that in one text exchange, Daniel had used the word loan twice, and I had used the word contribute, and there was no clear agreement either way, which Patricia said was actually useful. She told me that a transfer of that size with no gift documentation and with the word loan used by the recipient created a legitimate basis for a promissory note. She told me I had options. She also told me to stop transferring money immediately. I had already stopped. About 3 weeks after my conversation with Patricia, I received a document in the mail. It was professionally formatted, which I found almost impressive. It was an itemized invoice. At the top, it had Daniel's name and Vanessa's name. It had the date of the wedding and the venue address. It had line items: the balance of the venue rental, the catering final payment, the photography remaining balance, the floral arrangements, the transportation, the rehearsal dinner, the Maldives resort deposit, the Maldives resort final balance, the honeymoon flights, a line item simply labeled incidentals for $4,000, and a total at the bottom. The total was $146,000. There was a handwritten note at the bottom in handwriting I didn't recognize, which I presumed was Vanessa's. It said, "The deposit for the venue is due in 18 days. Please remit promptly. We appreciate your support of our special day." I set the invoice on my kitchen table and I looked at it for a while. Then I did something I hadn't done since Carol died. I laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because there was a kind of audacity in that document that was almost magnificent. I had already given $80,000. I had already been told I wasn't welcome at the wedding. And now I was being sent an invoice for the remaining balance with a due date, like I was a vendor who'd missed a payment. I took a photograph of the invoice on my phone. I sent it to Patricia. I sent it to Howard. Then I put it in a drawer. I want to tell you something about the weeks that followed, Because they were not easy, and I think it would be dishonest to skip past them like they didn't happen. There were mornings when I second-guessed everything. There were nights when I picked up my phone and started typing messages to Daniel and then deleted them. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with being shut out by the person you love most. A pain that doesn't care whether you're in the right, that just sits in your chest like a stone and makes ordinary things, making coffee, watching the news, driving to the hardware store feel vaguely pointless. Howard came over a lot that spring. He never pushed me to do anything. He mostly just showed up, which is the best thing a friend can do. I did not send money. I did not respond to the invoice. I did not call Daniel. About 10 days before the venue deposit was due, Daniel called me. His voice was different than it had been in months. Not the careful, scripted voice I'd been hearing. He sounded stressed in a way he wasn't managing as well, edges showing through. He asked if I'd received the invoice. I said yes. He said the venue deposit was due soon. I said I knew. He said they were counting on me. I asked him, very quietly, whether he remembered telling me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. He got very still on the phone. Then he said that was a complicated situation and there had been some misunderstandings. I told him I loved him. I told him that was not a performance and never had been. Then I told him that I had given him $80,000, which I hoped would be repaid eventually, and that I was not going to fund a wedding I'd been excluded from, and that I thought, deep down, he already knew that. He said, "Dad, if you don't help us, the whole wedding falls apart." I said, "I know." He hung up. Patricia called me 2 days later with something she thought I should know. She'd done some background research because she found certain aspects of the situation, as she put it, worth examining. Vanessa's parents, the ones who had supposedly suffered devastating financial losses and couldn't contribute to their daughter's wedding, they had not, in fact, had a bad year. Patricia had a friend who knew someone at the firm where Vanessa's father worked. His compensation had actually increased last year. The story about the bad investments appeared to be, in Patricia's careful legal phrasing, not well supported by available evidence. I sat with that information for a while. What it told me was not that Daniel was lying to me directly. What it told me was that Daniel had been told a story, probably by Vanessa, maybe by Vanessa's parents. A story designed to move the financial responsibility for this wedding onto the one person who would be guilted into accepting it. Me, the widowed father, the man who had nothing left to protect except his relationship with his son, the man who could be moved by the mention of his late wife. I was furious, but not at Daniel. Daniel was, in this picture, less a villain than a casualty. He had been worked on by someone much better at this than he was. I called Howard and told him what Patricia had found. Howard said what Howard always says when he's confirmed something. The venue deposit came and went. I heard nothing for 4 days. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Vanessa. She was composed and direct, and I will give her credit for this. She did not pretend we were close or that she was happy to be calling me. She said she understood I had concerns, but that Daniel had been looking forward to this wedding for a long time, that she had been planning it her whole life, that backing out at this stage would cause financial and emotional damage that I might not fully appreciate. She said she thought, as the father who wanted what was best for his son, I would want to step up. She said the venue could potentially hold the date a few more days, but that it was getting urgent. I asked her one question. I said, "Vanessa, why aren't your parents contributing?" There was a pause, a very small one, but I heard it. She said her family had been going through a difficult time, and she'd prefer not to discuss it. I told her I hoped things improved for her family. I told her I wished her well. And then I told her, as kindly as I could, that I wouldn't be sending money. She hung up before I finished the sentence. 3 days later, I received a text from Daniel. It said, "The venue is gone. We lost the deposit. Do you understand what you've done?" I stared at that text for a long time. Do you understand what you've done? I had given this boy $80,000 and driven 4 hours to knock on his door and sat across a kitchen table from him the night his mother died and taught him to ride a bike in the driveway of the house I was still living in. Alone, and he was asking me if I understood what I'd done. I wrote back, "I love you. I'm here when you're ready to talk." He did not respond. The summer was quiet. The neighbors' kids played in their yards. I refinished the deck. Howard and I went fishing twice, at a lake about 40 minutes out of town. The same lake we'd been going to for 15 years. I cooked dinner most evenings, which I'd gotten better at over the years alone. I called my sister in Cincinnati on Sundays, instead of Daniel. She'd heard some of what had happened and was angry on my behalf in the vocal, uncomplicated way that sisters sometimes are, and talking to her helped more than I expected. I heard nothing from Daniel for almost 3 months. In September, I got a call on a Thursday evening. I was in the workshop. I almost didn't pick up because I was in the middle of something and I didn't recognize the number. But I picked up. It was a man's voice, not Daniel. Older, maybe mid-50s. He introduced himself as Vanessa's father, Gerald. I won't pretend I wasn't curious. Gerald said he was calling because some things had happened, and he thought I deserved to know about them, father to father. He said his daughter and my son had separated. He said it had been, as he put it, an ugly few weeks. He said he knew there had been some conflict over the wedding finances, and that he wanted me to know that he had not been aware, until recently, of everything that Vanessa had told Daniel about their family's financial situation. I asked him what he meant by that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Vanessa had apparently told Daniel that her parents were financially unable to contribute to the wedding. He said this was not accurate. He said he and his wife had in fact offered to pay for a significant portion of the wedding, but that Vanessa had told them Daniel's family wanted to cover everything as a matter of pride. He said he'd believed this because it seemed, while unusual, not entirely implausible. He said he was sorry. He said it in the simple, direct way of a man who was ashamed of something he hadn't done, but felt responsible for anyway. I thanked him for calling. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat in the workshop for a while. What I was sitting with was the full picture, finally assembled. Vanessa had told her parents that my side wanted to pay. She'd told Daniel that her parents couldn't pay. She had constructed a fiction in 2 directions simultaneously, the result of which was that I was the only one who was ever going to be asked for money, and Daniel was never going to check the story, because checking it would have meant confronting Vanessa, and he'd been too deep in by then to do that. The wedding hadn't fallen apart because I refused to pay. The wedding had fallen apart because it was built on a lie. I still don't know exactly what happened in the weeks after the venue fell through. I've pieced together fragments from things Daniel told me later and from a few things Gerald mentioned in a second, shorter phone call. What I know is that, without the wedding as a structure to keep things moving forward, other things became visible. Vanessa, apparently, had made certain promises and representations to vendors that didn't hold up. There were vendors who'd been told payment was coming from a wealthy family friend and who were now calling for overdue deposits. There was a credit card Daniel hadn't fully known about. There was a pattern of behavior that, once he started looking, he couldn't stop finding. I don't take pleasure in any of that. I want to be clear about that. Watching your child's life become a harder version of what it should have been is not a victory. It just isn't. Daniel called me on a Sunday morning in October, which had been our habit, which told me something without him saying it yet. He sounded like himself, not the careful version, not the scripted version. He sounded tired and young and like my son. He said, "Dad, I don't really know where to start." I said, "You don't have to start anywhere specific." He said he was sorry. He said it several times, in different ways, and I let him because I think he needed to say all of them. He told me some of what had happened with Vanessa. Not everything, but enough. He told me he'd known something was wrong for longer than he'd admitted, that he'd been afraid to look at it, that it was easier to let me be the problem than to face what the actual problem was. He told me he'd said things to me over the past year that he'd thought about every day since, and that he was ashamed. I told him I needed to say something too. I told him I understood more than he knew about being in a relationship where the other person becomes your whole frame of reference. I told him his mother and I had been together 30 years, and the year after she died, I had been genuinely lost. A grown man with no idea how to organize his days without her, and that loneliness creates a hunger that can make you accept things you shouldn't. I wasn't making excuses for him. I was just trying to tell him I wasn't standing in judgment from somewhere comfortable and high. He cried a little. I could tell he was trying not to. We talked for almost 2 hours. He came to Dayton the following weekend. He pulled into the driveway and I went out to meet him, and he got out of the car and he looked, honestly, like he'd aged 3 years in 12 months. I hugged him, one of those long hugs that isn't efficient or tidy, and he didn't pull away fast the way young men sometimes do, because they're embarrassed by their own need. We went inside. I made coffee, bad coffee the way we like it, and we sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the photograph on the mantel for a long time. He told me everything, really everything, that Sunday. He told me about the first year with Vanessa, how extraordinary it had felt, how she had made him feel chosen and special in a way that had seemed meaningful, but in retrospect, he could see had been more about her needing him to feel that way than about him actually being that way. He told me about the slow process of being moved away from the people he loved, which hadn't felt like moving away because she was always giving him something to move toward instead. He told me about the money, which was worse than I'd known. She had spent significantly against cards and accounts without telling him, and the debt he was now managing was real and substantial. He told me about the wedding planning, how every time he'd tried to raise any concern about costs, she would find a way to make him feel that the concern was really just his failure to love her enough. He told me that one night, maybe 2 months before everything fell apart, he'd been lying awake thinking about our relationship, and it had occurred to him, not for the first time, that he'd let himself be convinced to cut off the one person in his life who had never wanted anything from him except his well-being, and that he hadn't been able to sit with that thought clearly, because sitting with it clearly meant facing what he was doing, and he hadn't been ready. I told him I was glad he was ready now. He asked me about the $80,000. He asked it like a man who already knows the answer is bad, but needs to hear it said plainly. I told him the truth. I had consulted with an attorney. There was documentation. It was categorized as a loan, and I expected it to be repaid when he was able. I told him I didn't need it immediately, and I didn't intend to make repayment a condition of our relationship, but that I was 63 and not in a position to absorb a loss like that permanently. He nodded. He said, "That's fair." He asked how we could get back to each other. I told him we already had, that the phone call on Sunday morning had done most of it, that the rest was just time. He stayed through Sunday dinner. I made the pot roast that his mother used to make, the one that requires starting at noon and mostly doesn't require doing anything except waiting and smelling it. And we ate at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important for a while, which was the most important thing that had happened in my house in a long time. Before he left, he stood in the front hall and looked at me for a moment. He said, "I keep thinking about what Mom would say about all of this." I said, "She'd probably lead with, 'I told you so,' and then come around to something more generous." He laughed, the real laugh, the one I hadn't heard in over a year. He said, "She'd say you were stubborn but right." I said, "She'd be correct on both counts." He drove away in the early evening. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights until they turned at the end of the street. I went back inside, poured the last of the coffee, and stood at the mantel for a while. Carol laughing at something off camera. Daniel, 19 years old, leaning into her shoulder. I thought about what it had cost to keep that photograph honest, to stay the kind of father whose presence in that picture still meant something. It had cost more than I expected and less than I'd feared. There is something I know now that I want to pass on, if you'll let me. And it's this. Protecting yourself from the people you love is not a betrayal of love. It is, sometimes, the only way to stay available to love at all. A father who lets himself be emptied out financially, emotionally, morally, so that his child never has to face consequences, is not a more loving father. He is just a more depleted one. And a depleted father can't sit at a kitchen table at dawn with his grieving son. He can't make Sunday pot roast. He can't stand on a porch and watch the taillights and feel, against all reasonable odds, grateful. Daniel called the following Sunday morning. We talked for 40 minutes. I told him about the fishing trip Howard and I were planning. He told me about a work situation that was going well. At the end of the call, before he hung up, he said, "Love you, Dad." I said, "Love you too. The lamp in my workshop still works. I've fixed it 4 times. I'll probably fix it again. Some things you just keep returning to, not because they're broken, but because the work of caring for them is its own kind of answer.